Welcome to another edition of the Petty Podcasts. This is your host, Stephen Petty. This podcast is going to be the second part of CDC and the ASTM Mask Standard. Hopefully you've had a chance to see the first part. The focus here will be reviewing the ASTM standard itself. We're going to go ahead and get rid of me and have more of the presentation. Alrighty, the Mask Standard is it's a little busy here, but we'll get through it. The ASTM standard for masks is F3502-21. Standard specification for barrier face coverings, BFCs is the new acronym. The summary of the standard, I want to cover, tell you what my view of this is overall, and then we'll go through why I feel this way. The standard admits that it's, for masks, it's not covering items that are PPE or respirators. Well, that's interesting. It's based on a perfectly sealed mask. I asked you to look to the right. You've seen versions of this picture. This is from the standard where the mask is glued down on it looks like a piece of wood. And I asked the question, is this the real world situation for the seal on your face? I hope not. It accepts less than 20 to 50% stopping of aerosols, not the 90% relative risk suggested by AIHA, American Industrial Hygiene Association, in their September 2020 guidance. It sets no criteria for gaps around the mask other than the manufacturer should ID what they are, and it sets no concentration criteria for testing. In my mind, my opinion is, from a public health and safety standpoint, it's essentially a useless standard. And you look to the right, I will put some of the language that's actually in the standard here. It's a little tight to read, but they define a respirator as a personal protective equipment. That's true. Designed to protect the wearer from inhalation of hazardous contaminants. Note that they say barrier face coverings are not designed to meet performance requirements of NIOSH approved respirators, i.e. they don't seal. An interesting admission. You question why this was developed and why CDC was so intent on putting it up on their website. What does the mask standard say? And I'm just going to go through some of the language. It says there isn't any precision that they can define. And they hope in 2022 maybe they can define that. And there's no information on the bias. In other words, how does testing of one mask different than another, or even the same mask over and over again? I write, wow, no precision or bias for a standard. That's incredible. But at least they admit it. The ASTM admits it. The question is, why did CDC adopt it? On leakage, remember I've been sort of on the warpath about the fact that masks cannot seal because of the gaps between the face and the mask. Here's what they say about leakage in the standard. The leakage assessment shall be reported by the manufacturer through a product design analysis self-declaration, i.e. you figure it out. How can these devices, I say to myself, and look at the language below on the design requirements. The barrier face covering shall be designed to cover at least the wearer's nose and mouth and fit snugly where it contacts the wearer's face to reduce gaps, not eliminate gaps, reduce gaps, as determined by the product design analysis. The only way I can comment on all of this language is to say on leakage, the standard says you figure it out, but it certainly doesn't say it has to be reduced to zero. It's odd. How in the world do you have a standard for efficacy where you allow gaps? Leakage continued. There are currently no specified acceptable techniques that are available to measure outward leakage from a barrier face covering mask or other products. Thus, no claims may be made with respect to the degree of source control offered by the barrier face covering based on the leakage assessment. Again, they basically have admitted that this standard doesn't deal with leakage and can't. So if it can't, how can this possibly be an effective mechanism to protect the public health and safety? It can't. What else do they say? Well, here's their definition of a barrier face covering. I guess this means mask. A product worn on the face specifically covering at least the wearer's nose and mouth with the primary purpose of providing source control and to provide a degree of particulate filtration to reduce the amount of inhaled particulate matter. Well, it's just odd language. We don't care about, honestly, reducing it a little bit. We care about reducing, primarily for COVID, the aerosol particulate, not the droplets. And we want to have a relative risk reduction of at least 90%. We want to protect the supermajority of people. And I say to myself, why bother having 20 to 50% efficacy on a perfectly sealed mask? Even in the perfectly sealed situation, it doesn't meet the 90% relative risk reduction criteria that's set out by our American Industrial Hygiene Association. And this assumes a perfectly sealed mask. That efficacy, as I've shown from other work, if it's 3% gap area, the efficacy goes to 0. It's interesting to look at, well, in the introduction of the standard, why was it developed? Here's an interesting read. The standard was primarily established in response to the global COVID-19 pandemic beginning in 2019 to address a product that is neither a medical face mask nor a respirator. So why are we in a hurry to get something out that clearly is less effective than a medical face mask or respirator? What's the hurry, especially when they're saying they can't address the issue of gaps and they have no precision or bias? I don't understand why, and it's not PPE. They admit it's not PPE. What's the hurry? Good question. Note 1, it's a fascinating note at the bottom of this first page. Further research is needed to expand the evidence base for the protective effect of face coverings and in particular to identify combinations of material that maximize both the blocking and the filtering effectiveness, as well as fit, comfort, durability, and consumer appeal. So we hurried this thing out, but we don't have adequate information to prepare or support it. So why did we do it? This is not a consensus standard in the sense that it hasn't gone out for review by people like myself or others who are experts in personal protective equipment. It's simply thrown out there. Now they fully admit all of the limitations of the standard. Good for them. But the question is, why put something out there that's basically so useless? So what else do they say? Nothing in the specification is intended to contradict or replace the criteria established in 42 CFR 84 for respirators or for the use of respirators, 29 CFR 1910.134. In other words, the information related to the design and building of respirators and their fit testing, storage, training, etc. This standard isn't designed to conflict with that because it doesn't address respirators. Nothing in this specification is intended to imply that the barrier face coverings qualify as approved respiratory protection devices or have FDA clearance for use in healthcare settings. 1.8 is a tremendous statement in the sense that it basically says these face coverings are not respiratory protection. And it also says that it shouldn't be used on anyone who has trouble breathing. Well, that's a basic requirement of a respiratory protection standard in the sense that you have to have a medical clearance to wear a respirator. That's, of course, not required in the masking of people generally. But it's interesting. This is sort of tacit admission that there should be some review as to whether or not somebody's qualified to wear even a face covering. It's interesting they specified the 2 years. That seems to be acquiescence to CDC, because even WHO says, UNICEF, that no one under 6 should be wearing a mask. And anybody in the 6 to 12-year-old range requires a risk assessment. So it's an interesting use of the term less than 2 years here. That seems to be tacit admission that this is intended for use by CDC. Key findings. The ASTM standard uses a perfectly sealed mask in its test procedure and provides no guidance on how to correct for gaps observed in real-world wearing of masks. They use an acceptance criteria of a perfectly sealed mask of between 20 and 50%, stopping aerosols, but they don't define really the size of the aerosols. And it's inconsistent with the 90% relative risk criteria that we in the industrial hygiene field would use. Furthermore, there's no criteria setting on what concentrations should be the starting point in order to use the test. Again, my opinion of this standard from a public health and safety perspective, it's essentially useless. I appreciate watching this. I really would enjoy having any comments, criticisms. I hope this helped out to understand what this mask standard is all about. Take care. Have a great day.